All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our final session of Praxis 1313. So we have, over the year, done close readings of critical contemporary texts on praxis and its relationship to critical theory. We've struggled over the year to understand how to properly think about how to reformulate the question, what is to be done, how to both answer the question but also critically re-examine it and all of its assumptions about power, about voice, about voices that can be heard and those that can't be. And in the process, we've dug into and we've debated a series of, I think, remarkable texts, from the Invisible Committee's Now to Hart and Negri's Assembly and the Multitude and their discussion of the common, to Left Populism with Chantal Mouffe's new book, the idea of communism, the weaponization of life, the undercommons. We've traveled to Frankfurt to discuss Horkheimer and Adorno's views on the unity or contradictions between theory and praxis, and also Bruno Latour's book with Martin Czar and colleagues and students there at the Institute for Social Research. We traveled to Paris to debate the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, with Etienne Balibar and Tony Negri and Ludivine Bantigny. And we come now to the last session. Now, originally, we were going to approach two other texts with a close reading, and those are remarkable contemporary, one is more contemporary than the other, but they are both remarkable texts on praxis, Hakim Bey's Temporary Autonomous Zones, and Joshua Clover's more recent book, Riot, Strike, Riot. Many of us have read, and we are writing about them on the blog and continuing the conversation, focusing on their work as a way to think about how theory, again, relates to praxis. And Joshua Clover's book in that regard is particularly interesting because there's this way in which, the praxis of Riot Prime, which is the praxis of our time, according to Clover, of course, is very autonomous from theory. It's happening regardless of critical theory. So many of us have read and are writing about those texts, but ultimately we decided to take a step back and to take a little bit more of more degrees of freedom, and I wanted to offer more degree of freedom to our extraordinary guests tonight, philosopher Amy Allen, author, war correspondent, critical theorist, and performer from Berlin, Carolin Emcke, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author of Blood in the Water, Heather Ann Thompson. Now, I say more space to explore the broader, overarching questions of what we're calling the space of praxis. From this philosophical, historical, and very practical perspective, how in the end do we engage this space of praxis that we've inhabited all year, metaphorically as a space, but also physically as a space? How do we relate this space back to the questions of critique? And what should we draw ultimately from this relationship that is so fruitful? And the idea here is to take a step back and think about the broader questions. Now, before doing that, though, I wanted to steep us, and before introducing our three speakers, I wanted to steep us really in this space of praxis, because today, like every other day, has been a long day of praxis for many. And I wanted to kind of immerse us in some of the things that have been going on today, because it started very early this morning with WhatsApp calls and texts and deep concerns very early at about 4:45 a.m. this morning, when the Baltimore Police Department raided the student protesters who were occupying the administration building, Garland Hall, at Johns Hopkins University. The WhatsApp went silent around 4:46 when there was news that there were Baltimore police coming and encircling the building More than 80 police officers of the Baltimore Police Department, as well as the fire department and a police helicopter, were dispatched to raid Garland Hall. City of Baltimore workers erected metal barricades around the perimeter of the building, the administration building at Johns Hopkins, and police forced entry into Garland Hall at about 4:51 a.m. this morning and arrested inside 5 of the student protesters who were protesting at Johns Hopkins, taking them out and arresting them, placing them in their paddy wagons as soon as they were able to get into the building. The 5 students, five students were arrested at the break of dawn at Johns Hopkins University, mostly graduate students, actually, who had been protesting, as you know, the fact that Johns Hopkins University had legislation passed in Maryland to allow for a private police force to police Johns Hopkins University. They were protesting that. They were also protesting the fact that Johns Hopkins University has contracts with ICE to train ICE agents. And so they ultimately they were arrested this morning and booked very early. There were also 2 protesters who tried to get in front of the police vans, who were then immediately arrested and taken in. This was the protest that was going on, and they had occupied the building since approximately April 3rd. So they'd had this ongoing occupation of Garland Hall for about 36 days, and they were really literally in the middle of negotiations. There had been letters going back and forth this week since Sunday, with the administration offering to meet them, to negotiate, to offer them amnesty, them responding that they wanted a particular form of amnesty. I mean, they wanted particular meetings on later this week, and also details about the amnesty and what it would include and what it wouldn't include. And they had been going back and forth with the administration with letters, and the last one they had sent was last night at approximately 12:35, asking for particular conditions about the amnesty because, among other things, the amnesty had certain exceptions in it that if they discovered something in the building that they would then, and so they were trying to negotiate basically. 12:35 last night, the students had sent their letter back, proposing a time to meet on Thursday or on Friday or on Saturday, and finally, of course, at 4:30 this morning, basically, the university called the Baltimore Police Department and stormed the building. So the students were actually in central booking all day. They still are. They've just been released from central booking. I just got a text literally 15 minutes ago, and I was going to invite one of the students to participate, but she is still at central booking about to leave. So basically they've been there since about 5 o'clock this morning. Fortunately, the state's attorney has decided not to file charges. And what's going to happen is that actually they are going to be abated by arrest. What that means, essentially, that's a legal term that means that the punishment has been the arrest, right? Getting booked from 5 a.m. till now 6 p.m. At the police department is going to be the sufficient punishment, although lots of questions, there are lots of questions that still need to be answered. So I wanted to start there in part because these are precisely the kind of contexts in which we are engaged in praxis and trying to figure out how do we think about these interventions? How do we think about the legal side of it, right? The arrests, the fact that there were public defenders who were there to deal with the arrest and possibly represent them at an arraignment, who were basically all day doing that, but thinking about the arrest from a legal perspective. How does it fit into the longer protest? How does it fit into the other contexts of the resistance movement here are, of course, indispensable questions, and this is the space of praxis in which we are. We are in it all the time. We are in it today. Let me just say that actually tomorrow Nikita Shepard has organized an extraordinary panel, and we hope you'll join us at 6:30 tomorrow night at the law school on grand jury, resistance to grand juries as political devices in the context of Chelsea Manning and in the context of Standing Rock. And so we've got Standing Rock litigation going on. Actually, Noah Smith-Drellick is here, our lawyer who's representing plaintiffs at Standing Rock. And we're going to kind of have this conversation also with Chelsea Manning's attorney and others about the question of using the grand jury as a political tool. But of course, what we've seen here is using the process of arrest, the process of booking, right, as a political tool. All right, so I wanted to steep us in praxis because we are there all the time. But to help us try to think about, in this final session, to try to think about the ways in which models of ways of thinking about critical theory might help us with our praxis, to help us think about this larger, broader, and global space of praxis, and to help us think also as well about prison praxis, prison abolition, prison reform, prison riots, and the relationship between reform and abolition. We're delighted to welcome Amy Allen, Carolin Emcke, and Heather Ann Thompson. We're going to first hear from Amy Allen, who is a liberal arts professor of philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies and head of the philosophy department at Pennsylvania State University. She is a critical philosopher, critical theorist, specializing in feminist theory, in critical theory, in 20th century continental philosophy, post-colonial and decolonial theory, and queer theory. Her book, The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, out with Columbia University Press in 2016, we've read it in our seminar, and it's a critical text where she really, in a way, fractures but also brings together a longer tradition of critical theory by dispensing with a progressive reading of history, retaining a notion of progress as a political imperative, but integrating basically the tradition of critical theory with the work that's been done in post-colonial, queer, and decolonial theory. She's the author also of The Politics of Ourselves, Power, Autonomy, and Gender in Contemporary Critical Theory, Columbia 2007, and she serves as the editor of the Columbia University Press series, New Directions in Critical Theory. So we're going to start with Professor Amy Allen, and then we will turn to Carolin Emcke, who we welcome from Berlin. Carolin Emcke is a world-renowned author, war correspondent, journalist, academic, and critical theorist, focusing on topics including sexuality, globalization, theories of violence, and cultural identity. In her autobiography, How We Desire, which is just out in English as we speak, 2019, and which she was invited to discuss on Monday at Penn American on a terrific panel there was Carolina Emcke talking about her book, and Edouard Louis, the French author, and Bill T. Jones, and Masha Gessen talking about her work. And in that biography, she really writes about her coming of age as a youth in the 1980s when sexuality was not talked about. In her passionate book-length essay, Against Hate, which also was released in 2019 by Polity Press, Carolin Emcke speaks out on the grand themes of our age: racism, fanaticism, anti-democratic forces. She's also the author of many other books, including Collective Identities from 2000 and Echoes of Violence from Princeton University Press, 2007. Her contribution to public life has been recognized with many awards, including the Otto Brenner Prize for Critical Journalism, Peace Prize for the German Publishers Association, which is actually Germany's most prestigious literary award. So I'm thrilled to have you with us, Carolin, and especially thrilled on today for good news coming in the mail. And then finally, we'll turn to Heather Ann Thompson, who, as you know, is the Pulitzer Prize and Bancroft Prize winning author of Blood in the Water, The Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy, which is really the first book that provides a complete history of the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and details the protracted legal battles that persisted for decades after the event. She's a historian at the University of Michigan. She's also the author of Speaking Out, Activism and Protest in the 1960s and the 1970s, 2009, and Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City. On the policy front, Heather Thompson has served on the National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon Panel on Mass Incarceration, which was the panel that studied the causes and the consequences of mass incarceration in the United States. And she's spent considerable time presenting her work in prisons and justice policy to universities and policy groups nationally and internationally, as well as to state legislatures in various states. And she's been very involved recently in the riots and uprisings in Lee facility in North Carolina or South Carolina, right? So we've got an extraordinary panel to reflect, and so I'm really excited. And we're going to start with Amy Allen, okay?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bernard, for the invitation, and to all of you for turning out during exam week, which I know is a busy time. I'm really delighted to be here on this panel with these two brilliant and incredibly accomplished women. I'm a little bit in awe, I have to say, but I'm going to try not to let it throw me off my game. So. So in my post, I wrote about how and why psychoanalysis might be important for rethinking the relationship between critique and praxis today. And I'm not going to go over the points in the post because hopefully you had a chance to read it. I thought I would instead use my time to just make a few points. One about critical theory and how I understand that project. The second about psychoanalysis and what kind of conception of psychoanalysis I have in mind. And then the third, to say a little bit about Melanie Klein, who is clear in the post, is the major psychoanalytic theorist that I'm engaging with in my current work on this topic. So first, a few words about critical theory. I was, partly because Bernard wanted to give us additional space in this meeting by not giving us a text to talk about. I found myself a little bit at odds about what to say, actually. So I was sort of doing my homework and trying to think about how to frame my post and my remarks. And as part of that, I read the manuscript of his book, Critique and Praxis, which is posted on the website, which I found really wonderful and I think has lots of synergies with how I think about the project of critical theory, but maybe also some differences. And so one point I wanted to sort of start with just has to do with the opposition that Bernard makes in that book between what he calls traditional critical theory and counter-critical theory. And the idea is, I think the basic idea is that what he calls traditional critical theory is sort of the Horkheimerian strand of critical theory, where critical theory is an interdisciplinary research project that brings together the empirical social sciences and normative philosophical theorizing to engage in the project of a kind of critique of the social totality, or at least that sort of grand image that's a project of critical theory that's laid out in Horkheimer's famous essay, Traditional and Critical Theory. And in opposition to that, Bernard talks about a counter-critical theory that would engage in a kind of project of an open-ended, ongoing analysis of power that would be non-foundationalist and non-positivist without being anti-foundationalist or anti-positivist, and most importantly would not be indexed to any kind of claim about truth, because one of his arguments is that the traditional critical theory project foundered on the problem of truth, and its attempt to offer a kind of classically Marxist theory of ideology that would be grounded in some conception of truth or objective interests or something like this. And I just wanted to offer what I think is a friendly amendment to this story, which is just to say that I think there was always, from the very beginning, another alternative vision of critical method that is not the same as the one that's articulated in Horkheimer's traditional and critical theory. And that's the idea of critique as the construction of constellations that one finds in Adorno's 1931 essay, The Actuality of Philosophy. And I think this conception may not be exactly the same as counter-critical theory understood as a project, but it has some interesting connections. I mean, for one thing, actually, Adorno doesn't use the term critique in that essay or critical theory. He talks about philosophy as interpretation. But it's quite clear that then this conception of philosophy as interpretation, which I and many others just interpret as a conception, or read as a conception of critique, is interpretive all the way down, right? So the aim of philosophy as interpretation is to interpret, as Adorno says, unintentional reality, or a reality that doesn't have any intention to it. So this vision of critique is not indexed to a strong claim about truth, nor to kind of traditionally Marxist philosophy of history, but rather it's indexed to praxis in a really interesting way. So Adorno distinguishes philosophy as interpretation from science, but he also claims that philosophy as interpretation has to draw on elements of empirical research in the social sciences. And in that sense, you might say it's materialist without being scientific, or contrapositivist without dispensing entirely with the empirical sciences. And the aim of philosophy as interpretation is the construction of constellations, that is, configurations of social reality that give rise to a demand for change. So on that view, the test for validity, the validity of an interpretation is not truth or fit to reality, but actually praxis. It's whether the constellation or the interpretation can construct social reality in such a way that compels some process of change or transformation. So Adorno says, philosophy as an interpretation constructs keys before which reality springs open. So as I said, I don't think this is necessarily exactly the same as the kind of Foucauldian-inspired vision of counter-critique that, or counter-critical theory that Bernard's developing in that manuscript, but at least I think they're fellow travelers. At any rate, I think the point is that the critical theory tradition is more internally diverse than this vision of traditional critical theory allows or makes clear. And in fact, I think, you know, there's a way of thinking about the history of critical theory that it was actually that vision of Adorno's vision of critique that became the prominent vision of the first generation of the Frankfurt School. I mean, because Horkheimer had largely given up on his own conception by the time they wrote Dialectic of Enlightenment together. So, although of course it's true, I think that the Horkheimerian vision is the one that kind of becomes prominent with Habermas and later. So, in any case, that's just to say, I think there's sort of resources from within the tradition that could be useful for spelling out this idea of counter-critical theory. Okay, second, a few words about psychoanalysis. So in order for the kind of claim that I want to make about the intersection of critical theory and psychoanalysis in the post that I presented, which is, the post is sort of crystallizing some of the ideas from a new book project that I'm working on critical theory and psychoanalysis. So in order for that to be fruitful, I think psychoanalysis has to be understood in a particular way. I mean, for one thing, it has to be understood in a way that's non-normalizing, and in fact, that even provides resources for resisting normalization. and it has to also be understood in a way that's emancipatory in some sense, and in what sense I think is important to think through. So on the point about normalization, I mean, and I maybe this is obvious, but I think it's worth saying because, of course, there are many different interpretations of psychoanalysis and very powerful and important critiques of certain strands of psychoanalysis for their normalizing effects, particularly with respect to sexuality. So I want to emphasize that the way that I take up psychoanalysis relies on a distinction between the theory of the unconscious, or the metapsychology, if you will, in psychoanalysis, and the theory of psychosexual development. So my thought is that it's possible to embrace or take on board some version of the metapsychology and to mobilize the radical and profound critical implications that the theory of the unconscious has for thinking about subjectivity and also history and politics, without necessarily taking on board the theory of psychosexual development. So without then getting caught in the kind of normalizing interpretation of psychoanalysis that, for example, Foucault rightly and I think brilliantly criticizes in the first volume of The History of Sexuality. So, and actually this distinction between the theory of the unconscious and the theory of psychosexual development is one that Foucault himself makes and endorses the former while saying it's possible to endorse the former while criticizing the latter. So, so I think also that Melanie Klein is a kind of interesting resource here because although in some of her early work, she does elaborate in great detail certain aspects of Freud's theory of psychosexual development. As her work goes on, in what I would call her mature, sort of the mature position that she develops after the war, really all of that stuff fades to the background, and the important thing has to do with her account of very early psychological development, psychic development, which is all pre-Oedipal, and so does not, I mean, it has certain gendered kind of features to it, but it doesn't in any way depend on the theory of psychosexual development. Okay, so part of the intuition that I have, which didn't come out in the post, but I thought I would mention here is another aspect of this way of thinking about the relationship between critical method and psychoanalysis, draws inspiration actually from Foucault's early work and his early claim that his critical project is supposed to do for history what psychoanalysis did for the theory of the subject. So I try to take that very seriously and think about what that might mean and how that might be kind of drawn on productively today. And I think the idea is something like, and again, it's a kind of an analogy between critical praxis, you might say, and psychoanalytic praxis or method, is that both of these are ways of dynamically working through the past with the aim of opening up or transforming problems or crises in the present in the direction of an open-ended or non-teleological conception of the future. And the idea is that if that's sort of what critical method does at the level of history, if you will, and psychoanalysis does something similar at the level of the individual subject. So part of that is there is a conception of emancipation, I think, at least in some sense of that term implied there, but it's one that is importantly open-ended, where the aim, as I understand it, the aim of psychoanalysis is not achieving something like health or social normalcy or anything of that kind. It's instead an attempt to enrich the personality, to open up blockages, to enhance freedom in some sense by creating new possibilities, and that there might be interesting ways to think about models of emancipation for critical theory that would kind of be analogous to this conception of individual emancipation in psychoanalysis, if you will. So it's not, in some ways I think I'm trying to do something similar to what people like Rahel Yegi and Robin Selikates have been doing, and going back to going back to psychoanalysis as a kind of model for thinking about critique, but the difference is that I'm less interested in starting with a diagnosis of a social pathology and then sort of thinking that we have to move from a notion of pathology to health, and instead thinking about opening up of blockages or problematizations in the present and transforming these in a kind of open-ended, non-teleological way. Okay, maybe I'll just say a few words about Melanie Klein, just so people have some sense of why she plays the role that she does in the post that I sent. I mean, my sense is that Klein is an underutilized resource for critical theory, at least in Frankfurt School circles. I mean, her work is actually having quite a bit of a moment in queer theory and affect studies and cultural studies, so she's certainly important in contemporary critical theory in a broader sense, but hasn't really been taken up within the Frankfurt School. And partly that's because, for the most part, most people working in the Frankfurt School right now aren't so interested in psychoanalysis, but I'm kind of interested in bringing that thread back for reasons that I talked about in the opening of the post. And I think Klein is a really useful resource for a number of reasons. One is that she has in some sense, a very relational conception of the self, and so it's a conception that fits with certain basic methodological intuitions of critical theory about the social, the relationship between socialization and individuation, let's say. At the same time, she has a strong conception of the drives, and so there's a kind of really fascinating, I think, duality to Klein's account. It's both, and her conception of the drives, I argue, is thoroughly relational. So it's not a biologistic, reductionist account of the drives, but for her, the drives are predispositions to relate to others in particular ways. So it's a thoroughly relational conception of drive, but one in which the drives are important, and also particularly the death drive and primary aggression is very important for Klein's account. So sort of she's squaring a particular circle, which is how do you think about the persistence of the problem of aggression without giving up on something like an intersubjective or social conception of the self. Two, I think Klein nevertheless has an account of how something like ethics remains possible and indeed even emerges out of primary aggression in a way that's totally distinct from the somewhat more familiar Nietzschean and Freudian version of that story. And this is something that Judith Butler has been exploring in her recent work on Klein in a really interesting way, particularly in her Tanner lectures. Third, Klein has, I think, a very productive account of reparation and conception of integration that can be really useful for thinking about politics, particularly in divisive times, and this is something I wrote more about in the post. And then finally, I think for Klein, analytic technique was thoroughly focused on the analysis of the transference, and so that's not necessarily unique to her, but it is an important feature of her understanding of analytic method. And so in that sense, she doesn't have some of the same ambiguities that one finds in Freud, let's say, where I think Freud can be read as thinking of analysis as working through rational insight, although that's not, in my view, the best reading, most productive reading of Freud. But whereas Klein, it's about the transference all along. So I think the last point that I made in my post about wanting to draw on psychoanalysis to think through how the concept of transference might be useful for understanding social change, Klein provides an important resource there as well. So the general thought is that Klein, as I said in the post, that critical theory needs to re-engage with psychoanalysis in order to be able to diagnose and understand certain features of the political present, and Klein, I think, provides an important and underutilized resource for that project.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks so much. I mean, and during the seminar, I think we'll explore more in part the trajectory of Adorno, I think, which is so interesting, which you bring up from the earlier work. I agree that in a way the relationship between Horkheimer and Adorno was kind of detrimental to both in a way that importantly asks us to kind of separate them. But to look at his trajectory from that theory of interpretation that you were talking about, but then to the later work, which really does resist, or I feel resists, the call to praxis. So it would be interesting to know how interpretation moves there. And of course, and then also we'll come back to the transference question, which, as I was reading your first article from 2016, I think, Psychoanalysis and the Methodology of Critique, at the end I felt that there was much greater resistance to the idea, but that it's coming along. So, resistance to the idea of psychoanalysis as the model for turning critical theory into praxis. But it's interesting to see that Melanie Klein may be the way out of that resistance. So, thank you. We're going to turn now to Carolin Emcke, who will start from Melanie Klein and continue there.
Does it work?
Is it on? Is it on? Yeah. Because in part, a lot of your work is directly related to that, particularly your most recent autobiography. So go ahead, Carolin.
Well, thanks everybody for being here, first of all. I'm quite amazed that so many people came, despite the fact that it's the last class of law school. So yes. Thanks very much.
For many, it's the last class in
incredible
of school.
Thanks very much to Bernard to invite me to this series. I probably think I can contest and compete. Let's say I compete with Amy on the level of intimidation, and I think the only I don't know, sweet that was offered to me that I accepted was that it's called praxis. So I'm really talking about praxis. I'm really not neither philosopher nor an historian, so I apologize a little bit if it's really more about the work that I've been doing. And what I will try to do is I will try to speak first about a very particular space, the space of the landscapes of war and regions of crisis. And I will first try to say what it is about this particular space that constitutes particular problems for the practice of witnessing. And in the second half, I will then talk a little bit more about, what I think hopefully a critical practice of witnessing in these areas and in these spaces could mean. First of all, when you work in regions of crisis or war zones or areas that are not even called war zones, but basically are territories that are sealed off, that have closed zones, you are confronted with, actually the materiality of walls and checkpoints and all kinds of attempts to implement on the people who live on the ground, first of all, certain kinds of politics of exclusion, politics of intimidation, politics of ethnic cleansing, politics of segregation, politics of separation, with all kinds of different aims. But the aims could be to keep a particular gender from participating in certain spaces. It could mean to keep a particular minority from participating in, whatever kind of democratic or political or social practices you could imagine. It could actually mean to, lock up, rape, torture, and kill those people that were, dehumanized and de-individualized before. So for someone who wants to write about this, it first of all actually means relatively simply the task of getting into these territories. And it may mean that you want to travel to areas where there's walls, where there's borders, where there's barriers. It might mean that you have certain kind of checkpoints that are just there in order for you not to enter these territories. It might mean that you get assaulted, arrested, beaten up. It might also mean that your office, the headquarters, call you and say, you have to go back, don't stay there. In particular, I mean, if I give that example of that particular scene, from my experience, the most dangerous moments in my life working as a reporter have always been moments when a peace deal was signed. The first 24 hours, the first 48 hours, when actually some kind of deal was brokered or negotiated, whoever felt they'd lost are in an incredible state of aggression and ressentiment. And this is one of these moments, and it's been extremely, extremely difficult to move then on the ground and to reach the people that you want to talk to. It might actually also mean that there's areas where there's no other way to get there than by joining a police force. I've been trying to avoid this wherever I could. I have not worked embedded. But sometimes you don't know that you end up in a situation that is embedded because, the territory is permanently, in a state of dynamic. So you don't really know if you end up suddenly on a battleground where you end up next to, a guerrilla fighter or militia or whoever.
These pictures were taken by your photographer who
Yes.
travels with you.
Yes, sorry. All of these pictures were taken by the photographer I traveled with. I haven't been doing this recently, I should say. The last couple of years I haven't been doing this, but I'm now using pictures from very different places where I've been, just to illustrate particular systematic questions that I think were interesting. It covers, I think, a span of 14 years and very different areas. So that's one aspect. I mean, one aspect one has to think about is if you want to write about war crimes, if you want to write about politics of exclusion, if you want to write about ethnic cleansing, it will mean that you are confronted with the difficulty of actually getting into these areas. And that's the whole point. The whole point of repression is to make certain groups and certain minorities invisible. And so nobody wants you to be in that area to write about it. The second part that I want to talk about is sort of not material spaces, not material obstacles, but obstacles to one's work that are rather on an imaginary level, on a psychological level. And the first aspect I would like to speak about is what I now call spaces of the unimaginable. You could possibly call this differently, but this is what I want to speak about cognitive dissonance or le pas chercher à comprendre. And that relates to the fact that when you travel to regions of crisis, this now is Haiti, as you can tell, after the earthquake in 2010, you are confronted with landscapes, with experiences, with reports that are just beyond your expectations. You're every day, confronted with something that is just against our normative expectations, but also against all our sort of cultural, social expectations. And I think what's very, very often underestimated is the epistemological problem just grasping it, of just understanding what's happening. I don't know if you know Primo Levi's account of his time in Auschwitz. And there's this passage that in the first days, just when he just arrived in Auschwitz, and he's overwhelmed by the brutality of the concentration camp, and he really, he struggles. He doesn't know how to adapt. He doesn't know what's going on. He tries to understand what the thinking is, what the logic is, what the rules are, just because that seems to be preconditioned for surviving. And he meets this little bit elder Hungarian inmate who's been in the concentration camp already longer than Levi, and he takes him by his side and says, "Ne pas chercher à le comprendre. Don't try to understand it. If you try to understand it, you're lost. It's an extra energy that you can't afford." And there is something about this that it is indeed, it's really difficult to understand. And it, no matter how much you read about it, no matter how much you imagine, how brutal a particular area might be, or how the devastation after an earthquake might look, it's just beyond comprehension. So I think prior to the whole question of how do you work, how do you write, how do you find people to talk, the first major obstacle is that, it's to overcome the state of shock that one is in. And the shock might also have to do with paradoxes, that you witness something that seems so impossible in that particular context. Like this is a band that was sort of Mardi Gras band that was playing on a funeral for one single person in a place where they had thousands of dead. And, you can see the environment, you can see the street, and I don't know where these people even had their suits from, all the instruments. So basically, it's prior to even, really assessing the destruction or the damages or whatever, you're primarily confronted also with images or experiences that you don't have a system of coordinate system to fit them into your normal comprehension. There is a second form of unimaginable that evidently has to do with the one that I was just talking about, and that has less, it's less on a sort of epistemological level of not understanding, but of not wanting to understand. The first one is not being able to understand. The second one is you're just so furious about what you see. In this case, in particular, that was something very special to Haiti, that many NGOs and many doctors tried to help, and they very often had to amputate limbs of the victims of the earthquake, and then they released them from hospital without thinking that there were no places anymore where these people could go to. So I spent a whole year in Haiti, or I went over and over again to Haiti over the course of a year. Every 8 weeks, I think, I was there. So I think the third time we were there, the same people we'd met the first time now had the second amputation, because evidently everything got infected again and there was no way they could take care of the wounds. So there are moments where you're just so outraged, or even yourself just overwhelmed by the quality of brutality, the shamelessness, evidently, the sadness hits you even when you're supposed to be just a witness. There's a third, category, I would say, of what I call the unimaginable, and that has more to do with your own biases, your own cultural, religious gendered, ideological formations and the way they, they blind you or they manipulate you in interpreting. I was in Kabul in Afghanistan in 2001 and went to, this is the former palace of the king of Afghanistan, and right next to the palace there was a tiny little museum, and we talked to a few guards who were standing in front of the museum, and they invited us in for tea, and they had a boy with them. The boy was 15 years old, and they had him as someone who would travel with them and serve them. And it turned out the boy had been kidnapped from Pakistan. He was, I think by now, 15 or 16, but he had been kidnapped 2 years ago. And so he served us tea, and then he sat down and took care of, the clothes of the soldiers. And at the time, I thought what a sad life this was, that this boy had been kidnapped, and he'd just been there, and nobody knew if he would ever be released, if he would ever be allowed to return home. I was really haunted by the story of this boy. And then years later, I read an article about teenagers from Pakistan being kidnapped and taken to Afghanistan and being raped. And only then did I realize, oh, that was a possibility I hadn't even thought of. Had this been a girl, my imagination would have been, my reading of the situation would have been very different. I would have immediately assumed, oh, she's kept as a sex slave. Just the fact that this was a male teenager kept that possibility from me. And I was always ashamed ever since. I don't know what has happened to him. I'm just giving this as an example of how our own, configurations and ideological, preformation actually might mislead us. And, not intentionally, it's not a lack of interest in the story of this boy. It was just, I just couldn't think of it. There's other obstacles that have less to do with the moment of witnessing, less to do with sort of the philosophy of interpretation in the moment, but more to do with the question, well, how do we then translate this into a text? How do we actually write about this? And there's a number of aesthetic or social or political conventions that unfortunately guide us. One of them is that when writing about war crimes or human rights violations, we're usually so concerned, we're usually so upset, we have such an ethical obligation to get this right, to write it so that people think this is credible and this has really happened, that we don't want there to be anything in the story that's too misleading or that might be misread or misinterpreted. Or so very, very often in areas where I traveled, every day there is something extremely funny happening. Like here, this was a former refugee camp in a soccer stadium, and the refugees had just a few hours ago, and they'd spent there years and years and years, had just been transported somewhere else, and sort of while we were witnessing, going to see that place, a group of guys showed up and said, okay, now we can play soccer again. And it's, these things happen, and then you don't write about this because somehow you fear that if you include that part in the story, that it's too funny, too absurd, too misleading, and that is sort of a convention, it's a taboo, and it's one that I'm worried about. I'll make it a little bit faster because I'm running out of time, I think. Similarly, this is just an image from Gaza that is just counter your expectations, I guess, from the Gaza Strip. There's other evidently aesthetic conventions as to how to both offer images or text of brutalities. I should give something like a trigger warning. There are now a number of images that might be upsetting to some, so don't look if you feel uncomfortable with it. And I've had a number of times that not only were the photographs not used of what we saw, but that even the description in the text, I'm sure Heather had that also, of certain scenes that the people would, in the headquarters would say, oh no, I can't bear reading this, could you please shorten that passage? This is a burn injury victim in the Gaza Strip that I wrote, and I wrote about what that actually means, a burn injury, and people did not want to print it. And of course, now again, the trigger warning, please. There are conventions about what is considered obscene. There's 2 pictures now that I advise you basically, not to look at or to look at, but and we hardly have any discussions about these conventions. There's hardly any critical reflection on what does it actually mean that something is too obscene to be shown or too horrible to be shown. And to end, and maybe that's more for discussion also, but to say, so what does it mean for critical practice of witnessing? That actually relates to, I think, what Amy has said before. First of all, I would say without a critical reflection about one's own presuppositions and ideologies, it's a horrible practice. Evidently, I think what we have to do is we have to claim, to subvert, to transgress the space that is contested, not just for writing about what we see once we reach these spaces, but also for showing the people who are in these contested spaces that A, one cares, and B, sometimes that it is possible to transgress them. And that seems to be sometimes even more important than me writing about it. That does include, as I've already said, the reimagining of the unimaginable as a sort of originally philosopher then degenerated into journalist. For someone who's trained by Jürgen Habermas and Carlo Apel in discourse ethics, it's an extremely complicated experience to permanently talk to people who are so traumatized that it subverts their ability to speak. Not necessarily the ability to remember, I would definitely question that, but their ability to give an account that sounds rational, that sounds intelligible, to give an account that's linear. So part of what, for me, has been extremely important was to develop a hermeneutics by which you can represent such discourse without erasing the trauma and still making it sound credible. And evidently, very, very often, one of the main tasks is to re-individualize, re-humanize, and making visible those people in these territories who are being negated, denied. And I think that also relates a little bit to what Amy was speaking about before, the reference to Adorno, is because I think the serious critical practice of witnessing has to try to do both, reach out for the truth and try to prepare sort of praxis that is ready for transformation. And so that is what I then call sort of counter-representation or counter-narratives, in the sense of you have to analyze how the people that you're interviewing or visiting or talking about are A, represented in your context, and evidently also what the political interest is of those who repress them, lock them or try to negate their sheer existence. And in that sense, I think it's counter-representational, counter-narratives, not in the sense that it's not truth-oriented. Evidently, it has to be. But it has to make sure that it doesn't reproduce the same logic of exclusion that is what these people experience in the first place. That was about 20 minutes.
Thank you, Carolin. Thank you so much for doing two things at least at once. I mean, one is presenting almost a theory of the praxis of witnessing, right? And so deftly bringing together that as a praxis itself, right? Which is so important, and your work is so important in that respect, and of which is something that historians do, and sometimes, and lawyers as well, when there is nothing more to do but to be the witness at an execution, for instance. But also relating it to these questions, where ultimately I'll come back to when I have my turn of this exchange with Primo Levi of not seeking to understand, right? Which is, I think, so rich and so provocative and relates to Amy Allen. But I'll come back to that. Next, we're going to hear from Heather Thompson.
Thank you. Forgive me, I'm having terrible allergies here, so if I sound like I'm sick, I promise you I'm not. It's just the pollen, I think, in somehow up by Columbia. It's ever since I've arrived just up here. But thank you, Bernard. Thank you, all of you, for coming, especially at this end of term. I know there's a lot to think about here, and listening to both of you speak, I'm wanting to go off in a million different directions, but I think I'm going to try to stick with my script, and notably it will intersect quite a bit, I think, with what Carolin has already said. So the topic that I wanted to share with you is really this question of theory versus practice and the crisis of carcerality. And so the spaces, those actually enclosed spaces and contested spaces and isolated and abusive spaces that I'm really interested in working on, writing about, but ultimately transforming our this nation's apparatus of criminalization, confinement, control, really the carceral state, the American carceral state, and specifically, for me, it's prisons. While the carceral state has always existed in this country, as everyone knows, in some form, and it's always been defined by the extent to which it's racialized and classed. I think we all know that the way that the carceral state has come to exist, this apparatus over the last 5 decades, is particularly marked by its size, its reach, and its set of devastating collateral impacts that are both historically unprecedented but also internationally unparalleled. And, you know, to chronicle those impacts, the really horrific conditions, particularly inside prisons, but also the devastation of communities on the outside, is really beyond the scope of the remarks I wanted to make today. And I gave you, I think, some of the readings about that, for example, from Alabama. But I will say, as a historian who's chronicled the conditions of confinement in this country, but also someone who regularly goes into prisons and tries to narrate them and witness, disclose, shine light. Carolin's right. It's we could spend literally an entire session, and I would love to do that at some point, really thinking through what the ethics of that praxis are, the limitation, the bounds. And if anyone has a Kleenex, could you please find one for me? I would be delighted. I'm really having, I'm so sorry. We're even filming all this. It's great. But certainly some of the things that Carolin mentioned really resonate with me. I'm going a little bit off script to say that when I was writing about the Attica uprising, trying to think about how to narrate trauma and convey abuse without re-traumatizing. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, I really appreciate it. without re-traumatizing people, without re-isolating them, without re-abusing them is really a challenge. And that book took me 13 years, and I think a great part of it was not just trying to find the sources that had been made unavailable because these spaces are so closed, but also to figure out how to write it. How one does that is a question of praxis, one that I think, again, we could spend a very long time on. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Notably, any state apparatus that is this large in size with this devastating a social and economic and political impact will create and probably inevitably spawns serious intellectual as well as political critique and discussion about its legitimacy, discussion about what to do about it, discussion about how to change it. And, excuse me, and certainly front and center in this discussion are people who have been personally most directly scarred and impacted by this carceral state. So when I'm speaking today, I'm not just speaking about people in the ivory tower, people who write books, but also people who have experienced this most directly. And in this session, I want to really share my thoughts on the logics of the possibilities, but also limitations of both one approach, which is to think about prisons as places that you can reform, where praxis should be directed towards making them more humane, and the other position to think about prisons as unreformable, irredeemable, and places that need to be completely eliminated. And I want to suggest, both position myself in that debate, but also suggest that I'm not even sure we can quite understand what the praxis answer is until we really think quite carefully about the theoretical apparatus of what is it that the carceral state does specifically, and what is its relationship more particularly with the American state itself in this case. So just quickly going through this without, I think, too baldly simplifying these really camps for the purposes of our discussion today, I do want to kind of outline what I think is at stake, both in terms of the theory and the practice. So I think as the readings that I wanted to, that I suggested tonight make clear, there are clearly those in our society, very smart and reasoned people, who see a basic need for institutions of imprisonment and detention in a democratic society. So just think about that for a minute. Think about all the people you know who that the actual existence of these spaces, that there's actually nothing inherently wrong with those spaces, and indeed they are necessary to stability and safety in a democratic order. But nevertheless, those same people are deeply troubled by the fact that over time, in this country in particular, those institutions have certainly come to abandon any commitment to rehabilitation, and thus the potential to make society safer. And they've also come over time not to embody justice at all, or they are no longer places where one might right wrongs, but instead exacerbate injustice, particularly race and class injustice. The theories that this camp, if you will, offers regarding why we took this turn vary. Some zero in on the economic logics of advanced post-war capitalism. So think about capitalism as it eventually descends into recession, as it embraces globalization, a need, for example, to warehouse surplus labor. Others point to the unresolved legacies of chattel slavery as the reason why prisons become the places that they are. And still others point to the recent rise of white supremacist politics. And of course, there's myriad hybrid iterations of these economic and racial understandings of the carceral state and why it looks as it does today. But when it comes to praxis, the fundamental starting point of those in this camp, that institutions of imprisonment and detention are not only a necessity in any advanced society that wants to keep its public safe, but that they have simply been hijacked or warped in the last years, suggests that the collective energy should go towards reforming the current carceral state, not dismantling it altogether. So what might we imagine in this camp? I mean, it's quite varied. It's certainly myriad foundations, you know, the MacArthur Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation, the Arnold Foundation, people deeply, working deeply in the space of criminal justice reform, policymaker influencers like the Vera Institute for Justice, the ACLU, I mean, really incredible work being done by really good-hearted people. The ACLU, I shared with you, the Cut 50 Project, people whose first question is not how do we dismantle the carceral state, but in fact, how do we make it a more just apparatus. The other interesting key group in that space is the group I was mentioning originally, which is folks who have been most directly impacted by it. And in fact, one of the largest organizations of returning citizens, Just Leadership USA, as they put it, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and they are very, very deeply involved in criminal justice reform efforts, particularly legislative and so forth. Now, again, I'm caricaturing all of this a little bit, but I think to what I hope will be productive end in our discussion. In contrast to this camp, there are those theorists and activists who do not at all begin with the premise that democratic societies must include institutions of immigration or detention, and indeed, they point to key moments historically where such did not even exist, or at least as we know them today. And they chronicle in ways quite startling and devastating both how such institutions are inherently unjust, and also, and this is key, that their central purpose has nothing to do with keeping us safe, right? So we'll speak more of that in a moment. Now, interestingly, this camp, if you will, shares some interesting understandings with theorists and practitioners of prison reform. They both, for example, tend to understand today's carceral crisis in the context of American capitalism. They both talk a lot about the legacies of chattel slavery, those unresolved and kind of permanently scarring legacies, and the imperatives of white supremacy. And also in this camp, we also learn a lot about the logics of settler colonialism and how that too is a lens through which, a theory through which we can understand this carceral state. But key is that these those in this camp see those mandates, those imperatives, those logics, not as situational, not as something that's been hijacked, but indeed as inevitable and foundational. So needless to say, when one views this carceral apparatus as inherently and inevitably and foundationally repressive and racist and unjust, in praxis, one is compelled then to call for the wholesale abolition of the system as we know it. Indeed, to utterly reconceptualize what it would mean to have a truly just justice system that might actually make the society safer. And, you know, again, unsurprisingly, as with the first group, this is not a monolithic group. I mean, everyone from Clarence Darrow to you know, those who formed critical resistance to amazing abolitionist feminists like Andrea Ritchie today. Like this is a very you know, abolitionism has a history as long as the history of the carceral state. But again, for the readings I wanted to give just a taste of those arguments, you had a chance, I hope, to look at Angela Davis's Our Prisons Obsolete, which people have often read, but not really read in the context of Praxis. You know, she does lay bare what she means by a prison industrial complex. Again, that tying it to the state and to capitalism. As she terms it, you know, this thing is antithetical to justice, and she makes clear that it has always been so, right? She compares Eastern State Penitentiary, when Dickens visits it, to places of supermax prisons today, and says, look, you know, it's a difference of kind, but it's certainly not a difference of substance. And so she rightfully calls for what she terms new terrains of justice. And then, of course, you got to read a lot, I hope, about Ruthie Gilmore, who also, you know, insists most emphatically that you don't solve a problem of state violence with more violence. And, you know, this is just a kind of a sampling of it. Here's the thing, though. So what might we do instead? Well, in my view, this is where there is a serious dearth of theory that might be useful to Praxis. And indeed, it's here where I think we could have some really interesting and fruitful discussions about what exactly is that relationship, or what does one theory then, if you are there, what then does it imply for Praxis? To Gilmore, the solution the solution to not solve social problems of state violence, it is to instead change the conditions under which violence prevailed. Makes sense. But how exactly might we do that? That remains exciting, but largely unexplored and insufficiently theorized terrain. Indeed, my own work of late suggests something deeply unsettling, which is that even if we abolish prisons, the logics that made today's carceral spaces so repressive might so easily be reproduced in any other system that we might imagine. Indeed, if we take seriously the argument that prisons are not now and have never been about making our society safer, but are instead institutions put in place to keep power relations exactly as they are, then how do we avoid reproducing the racial and class logics at work in today's prisons in our efforts to change the conditions under which violence prevails without overthrowing the broader system, those power hierarchies? So which leads me just to kind of share with you where I plant my flag in this space, and to invite us to talk about it. I'm currently working on an article that I'm calling, of course it's, as historians do, it's very long and must have a colon in it, State Building, Carcerality, and the Fate of Justice and Equality in Post-War America. But what it should be really called is The Lore and Limitations of the Liberal State. So let me explain. In this piece, I think a lot about the origins of the crisis that we face today in the carceral state, and where that leaves us in terms of Praxis. Now, I think it's a complicated piece, one that I'm still sorting out, but it's both deeply steeped in history, and also its central aim is to weigh in on this abolition versus reform moment that we are in. But its bottom line conclusion is this. I just want to share it with you. If we ever hope to implement a truly just justice system in this country, it is true that we must abolish prisons. But if we hope that this in itself would be sufficient, and would not just lead to carceral injustices in other forms, we also must be willing to rethink the logics of the American state itself. Why? Because in short, although most Americans, interestingly from die-hard patriots to social movement activists, they imagine, indeed pray, hope, that the principles of liberty, equality, and justice are foundational to the American state. And thus, from the perspective of even activists, the idea is that even if we haven't yet realized that in the American state, they can be realized, right? And I think what I've sort of concluded as a historian, certainly in this piece, but I think in my broader body of work, is that this is actually quite disturbingly wrong, because what is in fact core to the stability and longevity of this nation as we know it is a robust apparatus of criminalization, containment, and control. And it seems like a relatively obvious statement when just stated, and yet its implications are so deeply unsettling and destabilizing for this broader project. So to put it more pointedly, my empirical work as a historian and my attempt to make sense of all this, both theoretically and as an activist, makes it quite clear to me that the stability of this liberal capitalist democracy since its inception has depended not, as state critics and state builders alike have maintained, upon the health of its democracy, nor upon a more redistributive and thus egalitarian economy, or striving for any of those to become real. It is dependent instead upon maintaining the supremacy of white rule as well as the sanctity and prerogatives of capital, which in turn meant placing and maintaining serious checks on democracy, serious checks on challenges to its power via policing and prisons and the carceral state. Now, again, because the stability of this American state, again, a liberal, capitalist, democratic state, so again, if this is right, then it applies many other places, right? This is not a US-centric story, in fact. If it depends not upon robust democracy or upon finally realizing color blindness or classness, but rather on maintaining this robust apparatus of carcerality, then of course to challenge and ultimately overthrow the logics of the carceral state dauntingly and necessarily requires challenging and overthrowing the liberal capitalist racialized state. Whew. So, I'm not going to leave us there though. Because as we sit here today, and this I'm going to just go loop this to a close, going back to Carolin actually, as we sit here today witnessing the unimaginable and historically unprecedented as well as internationally unparalleled carceral misery of real communities filled with real and daily ever more traumatized human beings, pictures that I have that, you know, they're not Kosovo, they are not Haiti, they are not Gaza, they're Alabama, they are Michigan, they are New York. But we also would not want to gaze because it's too horrific. So then what are we to do when we are faced with these key opportunities to support a reforming of the system? A system that I think for all reasons, both empirical and political, is, let's just say, unlikely to be reformable, at least foundationally. So what about ending mandatory minimums? What about getting rid of 3 strikes? What about passing the First Step Act or the Clean Slate Act? Or what about improving medical care in prisons or ending family detention or improving visiting rules or supporting electronic monitoring and community supervision or other various so-called alternatives to incarceration that are currently being proposed? Well, notably and importantly, impacted persons are very clear on this question. We must indeed support, in their view, exactly these sort of prison reform efforts, not just to even half-heartedly or grudgingly, but loudly and most emphatically and energetically. And yet here, just to wrinkle it one more time, is a vitally important theoretical conundrum that we face if we do that, if we agree. Is it not the case that it's the very absence of such reforms that have mobilized countless people today to question the legitimacy of prisons and then to demand a world without them? In other words, it is out of the crisis that is born the desire, the energy, the activism to even imagine dismantling the carceral state, or is that not true? And if so, thinking about so many other theoretical debates and traditions and moments in world history, is this not the case where maybe the people don't know what they really need, what in fact might really free them? Might this be an argument for a degree of vanguardism in both theory and practice? Well, it is indeed the case that crisis breeds militancy and action, and that a lack of crisis, moments of successful reform, might indeed take the edge off of people's sense of urgency to act. But in my view, and speaking as a historian, it is a dire mistake to assume that impacted persons who today are fighting so hard for immediate relief via reforms hold any illusions or will hold any illusions that America's carceral system is just, or ever could be, even if it was made less brutal on a daily basis. In fact, in my view, it is the highest arrogance, scholarly arrogance often, but often political arrogance, to wonder, even privately, if impacted persons might need to be scalded in the fires of prison abuse and carceral atrocities more generally in order for them to get it, to question fundamentally the logics of those institutions and that apparatus, to motivate folks to want to overthrow them. And so, just to close, while I'm absolutely a prison abolitionist, one who comes at that position not just as a political principle, but as a historian who has documented its empirical wisdom, I also advocate and agitate daily for an agenda of what I always just refer to as radical prison reform. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it is a call for immediate relief and remedy. Not just, though, for humanitarian reasons, actually, although those are worth it reasons enough, but precisely so that those most impacted by this horrific system might assert their humanity and have it recognized. Because it is only when any of us are recognized as human that we can, as a collective, imagine the true possibilities for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all three. All right, so this is actually perfect. This is actually perfect. The way that the three work together is actually perfect to crystallize the problem, the puzzle of the space of praxis, and to kind of put a cap on this year, because in your presentations, actually, you brought us precisely to the brink of this tension, this puzzle, this problem, which we've been dealing with all year. Between, on the one hand, to start with, then say, starting Carolin with that exchange with Primo Levi, right? Don't even seek to understand. On the one hand, right? Don't seek to understand. It's not going to help. It's going to undermine you and your ability to navigate this space, right? Don't seek to understand, in part because it's utter domination, right? So for Levi, it's the utter domination of the concentration camp. But also, don't seek to understand, even in other contexts. I think we can push that to other contexts, not just to the place of total domination, which, of course, there never is a place of total domination, as we saw with the weaponization of life and with Banu Bargu's work, right? But I mean, almost total, utter domination, where there is almost nothing to do except perhaps take one's life. That can be also the space where we just have to act without knowledge, more in other places as well. On the one hand, so we have that, and then to contrast that with the kind of the opening intervention of Amy Allen on Adorno about critical theory as interpretation, as necessary to a necessary first step, actually, to understand and then be able to transform a space, and somehow possibly in the interpretive act itself being able to transform the space. But somehow the knowledge is coming first in a way, right? It's doing work that is then that then produces something about praxis. Or Heather, when you talk about kind of wanting to prefigure the carcerality theoretically before being able to address some of these questions, and the way in which ultimately, and maybe I'll come to it in a minute, but ultimately the way in which you resolve it as kind of, unless we understand the ways in which power is reproduced, we're not going to be able to achieve that much, right? And of course that was the problem that the students in the 1960s faced and debated, right? And which gave rise to such a notion of reproduction. Reproduction was so important in the late 60s, 70s. Reproduction, because it was the reproduction of power, because even if you seize power, it's going to be reproduced. And so we need to go to these spaces, the university, etc. But you are just right there in that spot where you're trying to negotiate the relationship between knowledge and what to do, right? Because we don't want to do something that's just going to reproduce. This is the problem of deinstitutionalization of the asylum, right? And when you talk about the continuities and the carceral continuities, I mean, right there is an enormous continuity that was not properly thought out at the time. But on the other hand, right, this necessity to engage in praxis, to engage in reform, to deal with the problems that we face today, right? It's that exact tension that has been at the heart, probably, of this whole seminar. Now, and I don't want to get too theoretical, but I just make one little transition. I mean, it seems as if we're almost caught in that dilemma, which is at the heart of all of these questions, that we're almost caught in kind of a Kantian trap, right? Of, you know, on the one hand, pure reason, or what we can know about the phenomenal world, about through appearances, what we can know, actually. And then in terms of practical reason, it's almost we can't know. So just, I mean, very simply, in the critique of practical reason, right, the idea is that we can't actually know this about the noumenal world, about the things in themselves. We can't know that there's freedom there, but we have to somehow assume it in order to act properly, in order to act according to the maxim, which can be universalized, etc., right? But it's the same, it's almost, I'm wondering, like, are we simply trapped in this duality, or was it rather that Kant was simply mirroring this trap that we find ourselves in? And it is precisely this way in which we've been struggling over the course of the semester to understand whether what we're doing is we're theorizing praxis, right, as if there's praxis that we need to theorize, or whether the theorizing is going to tell us the praxis. And I know that many of us, particularly in the other seminar, have been dealing with with the different models of ways of thinking in which, praxis could be theorized, or the result of theory, or a conflict, which Adorno ultimately comes to, some kind of dialectical contradiction that never can be resolved. But are we simply replicating some form of duality, some kind of mind-body duality? I mean, that's the question really that we're with Descartes, or is there something really there that do you really think that? I mean, do we really think that there is something there? I mean, your solution ultimately, Heather, is to somehow embrace, which is mine as well. We share this. We were just on a panel Friday at UVA, and it was clear that we share this. It is an embrace an abolition ethic, while at the same time being compelled to engage in representation, being compelled to work on the problems that are immediately faced by people, whether they're being arrested and put in, booking all day and trying to get them out, or whether they're about to be, executed or sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, or whatever it is. It's just like, you can't not do that, right? You just can't not do that because of our humanity, or because of the call on us, because it's a friend, right? Do you want to jump in? Just jump in then for a second.
Just on that quick point, because I think I ended so quickly, I didn't perhaps stress verbally the end, which is I don't want to argue, though, that this is the conundrum that we can't get out of, right? Because for humanitarian reasons we have to do it, even if it's the wrong thing to do. I actually want to suggest that I think we need to rethink what doing that reform work might in fact do as a liberatory project. So it's what I said at the very end, that in fact it is not until people's humanity is recognized that they can imagine a more humane existence for not just themselves, but for the world itself, right? So that maybe, and this is the uncharted terrain, maybe reform is not in fact the panacea, the opioid of the masses. Maybe, in fact, those reforms, because the system is so retrograde and so oppressive, by upending racial norms, by just simply asserting people's humanity in those spaces, there may be revolutionary potential there. And by revolutionary, I mean carceral revolutionary, but also societal. What would it mean for, 7.5 million people in the system, mostly black and brown people, to have real humanity in those spaces? Would that not itself, in fact, destroy those spaces over time? So I don't know, something to think about.
Right. No. Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Is that
Go.
the way it's supposed to work or not?
Yeah. Well. Yeah. We're going to open it up also, but wanting to respond is important. So go
Okay,
ahead.
thanks. I just also wanted to say, at least from my perspective, I don't think there is this, dualism that you suggested we are struggling with. At least in my understanding, I would say the critique of ideology, deconstruction of the logic of heteronormativity, or the logic of racism, or the logic of exclusionary politics, or of punishment and repression. The subversion of dominant discourse is a practice. I mean, at least that's what I would say, that's my work. I mean, my work doesn't have to be a practice, but I would say that is the practice. And if I understood all of our work, I would say that's what we do. Now, our part of the work has to do very much with the counter-narrative and the counter-representation to some extent, but I think that is a practice. It's also hopefully it's utopia practice, and that's the way I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, the Angela Davis text, because she also says, in part of her argument is to say the problem about abolition of prisons is that prisons are considered a normalcy, a reality. It's unimaginable to imagine that they would not exist. And then she refers to popular culture, to the way when it's sort of led to believe that they have to exist because they're just part of our imagination. So I think the practice, or the critical practice that I think that connects critical theory to critical practice is exactly that. It is to analyze, first of all, the logic of these politics of domination or power structures, and then hopefully subvert them with a different kind of description.
Yeah. Okay, but I don't want to give up on
I knew it.
I don't want to give up though on this notion of don't seek to understand always, right? In other words, I mean you've I would like to think that it would fit in so well and seamlessly with both of you, Heather and Carolin. And also, I think, with you, Amy. But I still don't want to give up that idea. Don't seek to understand. There's a moment when we do things because there's just a call on us to do it, and it's not like I'm not. And yes, I think it could fit in a larger. I think it could be thought and fit in a larger ideology of challenging heteronormativity or challenging or challenging othering in many different ways, but it's almost as if you act simply because someone's on the phone and they are in a space. They are in a space, and it doesn't make sense, and you don't have the time to do it. You don't have the capabilities. You might even not know anything about what to do. But you say, okay, I'm going to do something. You go ahead, Amy, and then we're going to go to Rosalind. Yes. Okay, go. So, no.
Oh, I was just going to say two things. Maybe there's an option in between striving to understand something in the sense of, in your Kantian sense, right? Like to subsume it under concepts or categories, and just acting without because one feels called, right? I mean, it's notable that Primo Levi wrote several books trying to make sense of the experience in the camps, right? Which I think is, yeah, and I think that's how I would want to sort of think about what interpretation is. It's not about, you know, rendering something rational in a Kantian sense. It's about, you know, in some sense, something closer to counter-narrative, I think, in the sense that Carolin talked about it, maybe. That's one thing. Just a little point about reform versus revolution. I thought that's fascinating discussion. And I taught this semester a seminar on Marxism, basically, and we read the Luxemburg-Bernstein reform versus revolution debate. And what's striking to me about it is that debate is not so much a debate about what our goal should be. I think both Luxemburg and Bernstein agree, in some sense, overthrowing capitalism, right? The question is about how do we get there, right? And the disagreement is, in some sense, then about the logics of history. But I think, you know, and I think where you were getting to at the end is sort of how I would think about that. I don't think we know what is going to work, right? And there are things that turn out to be, in retrospect, revolutionary transformations historically that start small, right? And then there are, of course, you know, cases of, you know, your classic revolutionary, you know, French Revolution, let's say, for example. So yeah, I think that's just another way of thinking about, you know, there's a kind of arrogance, historical arrogance, you might say, in thinking, yeah, we know what, if we do this, then that will lead to the transformation that we want. And so being more experimental might make sense, given that.
Thanks. Rosalind, jump in. Turn on, just turn on that, go towards you. Yes, yes.
I'm always perplexed why you have such a great antipathy to truth, maybe it's because you work in law, but in the legal profession, in some vicinity of the legal professions. But, you know, I'm asking Bernard what the problem is with truth, but when I hear you commence the discussion this evening with an understanding of ideology critique as the adducing of what are people's objective or true interests as opposed to what they believe them to be, I feel that this is the crux of your concern with the discourses of truth and ideology critique. And it rests on a notion of ideology that I don't think most critical theorists have ever held, which is to say that you could simply invert the picture of the world. You could produce a counter-narrative, and somehow you would be able to properly represent what are the real interests that people are somehow obstructed from grasping. But I take it, Amy, that part of what you're putting on the table is the importance of the unconscious and therefore of the task of re-educating or reforming or restructuring the unconscious. Because when you respond, Bernard, to a phone call that says someone needs you, you cannot assume that everyone would respond that way. I mean, in the deep, long training of you as a subject, you have become the kind of person who responds to that call. But we know that many such calls come to people, representative states, and they don't respond that way. And yet you feel it as an automatic response, and that's interesting. That, you know, that means that at some level it has been inscribed at a level so beyond recourse to the understandable that it works. It produces its effect. But I guess my question for all of you is whether the kind of change that you are advocating, either through the mechanisms of writing and or other kinds of things, or have to have as their goal the transformation of desire in the unconscious. Otherwise, they're simply going to be policy acts, one after the other after the other. But that's a real question. That is, how does one make a praxis of transforming the unconscious? It's not transference, maybe one of the media. But the other is, what is the problem with truth? Everyone here has spoken. I know you don't. But Bernard, you do. What is it? I mean, are we not seeking in some ways a different kind of truth? But you started off with, we didn't like truth.
I started by recapitulating your view.
Yeah, so let me see, how could I rope that in? Because somehow that's probably fundamental to our thinking about the question of abolition. what is it that I don't like about truth? I'll tell you, I don't like about truth the fact that actually the way that our space is created is that practically everybody believes that the prison is functionally necessary, right? When you opened up, Heather, right? I mean, it's extraordinarily rare to find anyone who is prepared to say that the project is not reform and not rejiggering carceral systems, but actually abolishing them. And more than that, abolishing the society that gave rise to the prison. And I think that, you know, we have to check ourselves, because I think it is so innate and secondhand. The turn to the prison is just, it's, you know, I mean, it's easy for us in this room among critical theorists who are engaged in these issues, but in a broader conversation, it's like that is dominant. It is dominant. That's my problem. It's that we would wear those glasses so easily, that that would become so second nature, that would be something that we would all practically believe, or so fundamentally, or that the first question is always, well, what do you do with the murderers and rapists, right? Right? We don't even have answers for that. Even the abolitionists who don't really have answers for that, we push that off. We say, look, that's not the first question to ask, right? And it isn't the first question to ask, because there's mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration, that is affecting so many people in so many ways. But we just say, well, look, don't ask that question first. Maybe we can get there later. Maybe we can deal with that once we've dealt with everything else.
But why is that a question of truth? I mean, we have a kind of scrupulous empirical history here that offers the means to argue against this claim, the automaticity of that response, which says, oh my goodness, you know, there are all these terrible people, they've done these terrible things, we can't let them run around. I.e., that has become a kind of unconscious axiom. But also a kind of structure of desire, right? I mean, the other truth of the carceral state and other forms that like it is the kind of drive for vengeance, the pleasure in vengeance, the real demand for an economy. You know, that's another truth that we don't talk about. But it's a real question that I want to understand about why the critical theoretical project has to be reconceived in your mind in such a way that it puts aside the question of truth, that that's not going to be a useful terrain on which to try to find justice in these other ways. Is that not, I mean, to the extent that an empirical argument is useful in this process, it's because one has a belief that we have an incorrect perception, which nonetheless has become second nature and totally cathected to all sorts of other things. So, I mean, maybe one needs more. That's true.
For me, the question is actually, and this is maybe skirting the
Take the mic.
but maybe it's not helpful in that example to think about truth, but it's actually about myth. And one of the things that the empirical work does is it explodes myth. And whether that gets closer to the truth of what the project is or should be is, I think, perhaps a secondary question. And that's because, and this is, I'm not sure this is what you would argue, I don't know, but for me, it's because the problem with truth for me is the question of whose truth. So when we talk about, it's particularly with regard to the carceral state, the carceral state does work for some people. So it is true, actually, that the carceral state works for some people, right? It works for people who are not in it, who are not, whose votes they get to use when other people are in it, whose jobs they get to take when other people are in it, and who are not living in their neighborhoods because they are incarcerated. For some people, the truth is that prisons do work. The problem with truth as a theoretical or a philosophical or even a critical theory project is we always have to be very, very cognizant of whose truth are we talking about, because the project looks very, very differently depending on where we sit. So to me, and for that reason, truth is not helpful as much as, well, I don't know, as much as what?
Go ahead, Carolin.
I don't know if I was asked the question, but I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood about this. For my task, it's indispensable to believe in the truth and the possibility of searching for, I mean, you know, and that may, and I think that the task is only, and that's what I was trying to say, particularly difficult under certain circumstances. A, because people have no interest in the truth, because it's hidden, because it's, you know, behind walls in certain areas where it's difficult to get. So I couldn't do any work without the desire to, you know, search for the. That's not saying I make mistakes and you know I'm erroneous, and it's not to say that I don't think part of searching for that truth does include thinking about the unconscious, does include thinking about one's own formations. That for me was the example also of the boy in Afghanistan. So it does include a critical reflection on all there is that might hinder me, you know, discovering something. And I think the Primo Levi, the ne pas chercher à comprendre, wasn't meant to suggest that one should not try to understand, or that I should not try to understand. I used it as a reference to suggest what might happen to you when you are suddenly confronted with situations whose logic is so outrageous, so amoral, so cruel, so brutal, that you just don't get it. So, to me, that, and Steinlauf, the friend of Levi, basically just says that in the moment so that he can survive, but it's not a call for action. So, at least that's neither how I understood it, nor how I wanted it to be used.
But just before, Nikita, you're going to take but just to intervene here, because I think we would need to go back to Adorno, as maybe Amy Allen had started, and this notion of an interpretation, right, that helps make sense of the world. An interpretation of our carceral capitalism that helps make sense of the way in which it structures a social order, a racialized order in this country, right? Now, I don't think it's helpful to talk about it in terms of truth so much as it is helpful to talk about it in terms of an understanding, an interpretation of the world that has real effects, and that ultimately, though, I'll revisit, but that is it is what is going to be compelling to our praxis right now. And so, but it is a complicated interpretation of all of the ways in which carceral neoliberal capitalism preserves, entrenches, reproduces a racial hierarchy and a social hierarchy in this country. I mean, that's a complicated and I think pivotal, important, motivating, necessary interpretation of the whole space within which we find ourselves, right? With the caveat that as we embrace that and act, engage in praxis, we may need to reconsider that interpretive a lens as something else emerges, as we didn't see at some point when we didn't, as we hadn't seen the gender dimension or the queer dimension, or right, that that those interpretations are powerful and yet probably also missing something, right? That it took us something else to see, and some other conflict and some other form of domination, and that we hadn't, we hadn't focused on the question of trans discrimination, say, in the carceral context. And when we now kind of turn to that as a result of critical practices that then shed light on new things, that because we enter a space, because we take that phone call and say, okay, well, I'll be there, hold on, we all of a sudden see something new, and it actually changes that whole interpretive lens we have in a way. And so it wasn't true. Like, it's this evolving thing, and that it's got some wrong things to it, right? It's got some wrong things to it, right? Yeah, I mean, that's what I would want to hold on to. But I apologize but I just really want to respond. I apologize for monopolizing because Nikita's been waiting patiently. Sorry.
I wanted to offer some thoughts on some of these themes by first weighing in on reforms and then on this question of whether crisis breeds militancy in action, and get through those things as a way of talking about imagination. So in terms of the question about reforms, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a transgender advocacy group based in New York, has a useful tool that they use in trainings with activists for evaluating reforms in terms of whether they ultimately, on a structural level, reinforce versus dismantle the prison industrial complex. So looking at, for trans activists or LGBT activists, for thinking about particular initiatives and evaluating them in that sense, which I think maps nicely onto what you were saying about sort of radical reforms. Though I would note that even in the years since that tool was developed, the complexities, some of the complexities around new technologies and logics of carcerality may complicate that framing even a bit more. So thinking about, for example, with electronic monitoring and things like that, how if we take this theoretical insight that carcerality shouldn't just be understood as a set of institutions, but as a logic of power, that on the one hand, it makes that calculus of evaluating the impact of reforms more difficult, but on the other hand, and this is a place where the praxis can really come in, it also extends the points of intervention against logics of carcerality away from just prison reform to every aspect of our society, to everything from the 3,000 surveillance cameras that are on Columbia's campus that are normalized in our everyday lives in the way that we conduct this seminar, to all these different aspects of how we organize everything from academic work and teaching to activism. But it still leaves us with the question that you raised about the extent to which reforms could serve to diffuse a sense of crisis that could breed militancy in action. And considering it historically in terms of histories of revolutions and things like that, to me, the analysis that I have come to is that it's not absolute immiseration, but the gap between what people imagine to be possible or expect themselves to be entitled to and their realities of circumstances that I believe to be the catalyst to action. And so a sort of like liberal notion that it's just simply that the reason why the prison industrial complex exists is simply because people aren't informed enough about it, I don't think stands up anymore. But that if there is a role for praxis that we could imagine, that a lot of it will have to do with the imagination, with expanding this sense of challenging this sense that folks have mentioned about the unimaginability of certain other forms of life. And one sort of like real light bulb moment for me in terms of how this could look came in Andrea Smith's writing about ending violence against women of color, in which she at one point mentions how we, meaning activists struggling against violence, shouldn't assume in the way that we imagine our solutions, shouldn't assume as a given the continuation of the nation-state form in general, or the United States as a political formation in particular, which, when I read that, just exploded my brain in this beautiful way because of the extent to which the liberal capitalist state, and the particular one that we live in, is just seen as so unquestionable on this fundamental level. So I would, I would just wrap that up by saying, like, I hope that as we move forward with whatever comes out of this seminar, that we can think about critical theory not just in its interpretive and analytical dimensions, but in its dimensions of expanding the imagination and the horizons of possibility.
I know Jeff wants in. Would you want to pass the mic down to Jeff while anyone want to, if you want to jump in? But, okay. All right, and then we'll come back to you. Turn it on by pushing the thing up. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't have very organized thoughts, just sort of reactions. Thank you so much. I feel like this has been such a wonderful way to wrap up the seminar, and it also has so many applications for something that I care a lot about, but it doesn't really isn't as centered in this discourse that much, which is non-human animal life. It's been touched on sort of a couple of times over the course of the year, but never really at the center. And the sort of reformist versus abolitionist view, those two sort of camps are obviously a very big part of it. And also just being confronted with the logics of terror in places where there's just mass slaughter, I think really resonates in that space as well. I guess, so the one thing that I've been thinking, listening to you, thinking about the possibility of reformism, which has maybe come up a couple of times over the course of the year, is just praxis taking the form of just experiencing new forms of life and new imaginations of how to live. I was thinking of Jackie Wang's utopia of the feminist commune, and I think Camille Robsus wrote about this, also tying together the psychotherapy and carceral logic idea of institutional psychotherapy and sort of new ways of patients and doctors living together in a space, and the idea being not even really the focus on healing a patient, but sort of healing ourselves as we live together. And so I think, I know this is kind of rambling, but I think that I agree with Professor Harcourt that in my sort of personal praxis, I hear the call often. If there are activists who have been arrested for trespass to go onto a farm and save an animal's life. And I hear the call to help with their legal work. But I also think that part of the praxis needs to be just imagining and living through new ways of living with other creatures. I think that just engaging in living together in new ways that have sort of seemed unimaginable before. I think that's sort of that's an idea that has been groped at over the course of the year and again today.
Why don't we get a few more voices, and then we'll come back to the panel maybe with final thoughts responding to some of these. First, we're going to turn to Dr. Camila Vergara, who this afternoon at 3:30 today became a doctor. She passed her dissertation
Thank you, thank you.
with honors.
Unanimous, by the way.
So,
thank you.
so now it's Professor Verga.
Doctor, yes.
Herr Doktor,
I've been teaching for a
Professor.
while.
Yeah.
Now, no,
Yeah.
only a doctor. Yes. So I wanted to open up a discussion about psychoanalysis and the blockages, because the blockages, because this basically Amy was saying that what psychoanalysis does is then open up the blockages and it allows for the emancipation of the subject. Maybe it would be fruitful to think about this through Althusser's aleatory materialism, in the sense that it is not blockages when you. So when the conscious meets the unconscious, it's not only that you go into a blockage. What happens basically is the conflict opens up possibilities of dealing with the dissonance that is within ourselves, supposedly. And in terms of dealing with praxis, I would argue that it is the kind of the, as you say, the interpretation, what is allows us to bridge this encounter. So it's basically the encounter with the cognitive dissonance, basically when we have to confront our conventions and biases, when this space opens up. So it's not only the witnessing, I would say, it is actually the critical encounter and the conflict that this generates in our own brains and our own moral sense that allows for this space to open up. So it's not just the witnesses of the objective, sense. I'm also a journalist, so I was also trained in the Habermasian understanding and the objective witness. In a way, and how the dealing with the carceral state and making something visible, as you say, it is not just a failure in a sense that it's on reformist and it doesn't conduce to anything, because in a way, if you force the encounter, so if you engage in psychoanalysis and you actually need to force the encounter to the rest who are not being actually maybe not profiting from the carceral state, but are not touched by it and therefore is normalized and accepted, if you force that encounter, you're actually forcing open ways out of it, if you will. And if talking about Luxemburg, the idea that every form of class struggle and every form of a political praxis by the working class is not a failure, even because it allows for this collective learning for the future. So in a way, kind of this visibility of opening up. And lastly, in the terms of the abolition of prisons, I would say that we focus too much on who is in prison and the people that are dominated inside prisons, but we think little about the people that are not in prison and should be in prison. So because the first question is, what do you do with rapists and sexual assaults that actually are perpetuating the hierarchy of male dominance and the heteronormative and all this kind of structural domination in society? Because we have been penalizing and criminalizing a part of the population that is basically based on more capitalist-related crimes, and the other people that basically have wrecked the economy and targeted racial minorities for bad mortgages and all these things are loose. So they are inhabiting a public space, and we are cool with it. We have been normalized in a way. So what do we do? How do we deal with this in the idea of the abolition of the prison system? While people that are basically should not be in prison are in prison, and the people that are in prison should be out, or the other way around, because basically sexual assault and rapists are the majority of people are out. They're not in prison. So,
thank you, Camila. Darshana, do you want to grab the mic? Pass the mic down. Thanks.
Wow.
Double mic?
No, just single mic is enough. So I'm actually just going to intervene as a lawyer. I think sometimes we keep talking about the duty to respond to phone calls in the middle of the night, and I think I wouldn't necessarily see that as participating in the reformist project. There is a slippage that can happen between imagining yourself as a service provider, which I believe is the only role that lawyers should occupy in any sort of movements, to imagining yourself as somebody who can have any actual, apart from purely procedural interventions, to make in what reforms should look like. And responding to calls or representing people in courts of law is what I see as part of the ethics of representation, of assisting people through the state and the carceral system, even while maintaining that what should be the demands of a movement that seeks to dismantle that carceral system are not questions that I as a lawyer would ever answer. I think the Sylvia Rivera Law Project example is a great example because lawyers are participating in that. It is called the Law Project, but they participate in it only as service providers with specific forms of legal technical knowledge that they provide, and then the community then takes that knowledge and decides what to do with it. So I think there are these slippages in my mind can be quite dangerous because that's what leads, again, speaking only as a lawyer, it's different for different people who are part of the movement, but these slippages are what lead lawyers to move from, I'm a service provider, I'm going to be helping you through this system, to I'm going to engage in large-scale constitutional litigation to completely determine and change what the objectives of this movement should be, thereby moving into a completely reformist position from what could have been a very revolutionary movement on its own before the lawyers took over.
Thanks, Darshana. We're going to have one more intervention before coming back to our guests.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the wonderful panel. It's been really a joy. I'm here for the first time, so I will just ask a quick question and share one thought. I'm in the sociology department, and I study support for the far right and the reproduction of sort of these attitudes that tend to, like racism, nativism, etc., that are linked to support for the far right. And my question, especially to Professor Thompson and Carolin Emcke, is if, I'm going to go one step back. One analyst of the far right, Kasmure, his argument is, he's a political scientist, he says our problem has been that we have understood it as a pathology. We need to understand it as what he calls a pathological normalcy, right? And only then can we really understand where the support for the far right is coming from. And so, similarly to the argument around the liberal state and capitalism and how it really sort of requires us to question these very fundamental categories in which we're thinking, and to Nikita's point about the nation state and questioning the nation state. I wonder if you can speak, especially Carolin, since you've been writing about hatred and the far right in Germany, for example, what this means for our work, right? So if the recognition is this is not a pathology, this is actually commonly, sort of unimaginably mainstream, these ideas about who we are, whether we belong, why we belong, who does not belong, what does it mean for our, again, like political practice specifically vis-a-vis the far right. And then one very quick thought on the conception of truth as whose truth, whose voices. It reminded me of Anna Julia Cooper's idea about the truth, right, in A Voice from the South. And I just wanted to, as in sociology, we're trying to recognize her as part of the canon. She's often left out, sort of raise her voice into this debate as, truth being sort of what happens when many voices are represented, especially when the voices of those who have been silenced are included in the debate. And so at the time she was writing, especially about black women, we can also think about other voices. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about truth, possibly. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to come back and maybe I'll start with Amy and then we'll go to Carolin and then Heather, and maybe you can kind of address some of the issues and give some final thoughts.
Okay, thanks. Just for Camilla, yeah, thank you so much for that question. I actually had some of Althusser's earlier work in mind in thinking about blockages or connecting the psychoanalytic idea of opening up blockages to some sort of Foucauldian understanding of problematization. And I think there's a way to do that kind of through Althusser's notion of ideology. I don't know. So anyway, this is just to say I think that suggestion is really interesting. But I hadn't thought of bringing in Althusser's later work there, so that's something I'll have to really think about. I mean, yeah, what attracts me, I think, about this idea of blockages is that I think it makes sense both at a kind of individual and a collective level to think about ways that we can get stuck, and we might even actually know that we're stuck, so that like having further kind of rational insight into our stuckness, like individually or, you know, collectively in some kind of really problematic social structure or system, doesn't necessarily bring about change. So then if that's the case, how can we think about working through the stuckness in a way that can bring about change? And that was the idea that I had about trying to use the transference and analyzing transference as a way of thinking about actually transforming ideologies. So one other thought about imagination, and just to come back to the point about truth, yes, I think expanding imagination is really key, and sort of, you know, creating new social and moral imaginaries that can, you know, have transformative effect is probably, in some sense, more important than trying to like get at the truth. I mean, this is what I would have said, you know, to the question that was really a question for Bernard about what's the matter with truth. I mean, I think it's the problem is with the assumption that we could get at some kind of neutral, objective, singular, right? Okay, so, but I think that's the sense in which truth gets opposed to ideology, right? It's true consciousness, objective versus false, objective interest versus subjective interest, and so on. And that's the sort of problematic that we get stuck in when we start, you know, talking about truth versus interpretation or transforming the imaginary. It sort of takes you in a different direction, I think, with a different kind of criteria of adequacy. The criteria is not, is this way of understanding carcerality or whatever true or false? It's, you know, does it represent social reality in a new light that allows us to understand it differently and that opens up new possibilities for praxis? And I think that's, I mean, all of that's perfectly compatible with saying that certain particular statements are, you know, could be true or false. I mean, I think there's different levels of thinking about the truth, so we don't have to give up on being committed to finding out, you know, the truth about what happened at a particular, you know, that's perfectly compatible with thinking that at the level of, you know, critical theory, let's say, or theorizing about entrenched social inequality and oppression, that that we're doing something else.
Thank you, Amy. Carolin?
Yes, I'd like to answer. I don't know if I can answer, but you know, make an effort in responding to the question about how do we think and analyze the racism on the right, radical movements and regimes, I would say. We're not only talking about movements. And there, I think it's I think it's extremely important to sort of not exoticize racism. And there is a tendency, evidently at the moment, in the public discourse to do this. It's, you know, the racism in the East, so it's, one tries to territory, I mean, you know, it's always extraterritorial, it's always somewhere else from oneself. Nobody wants to be a racist, not even the racist wants to be a racist. So that I think there is, it's an extremely important sort of strategy of analysis. Just, I think, very similar to the question of how to think about incarceration, you know, as a general social phenomenon. And yet, there is something I have to admit where I resist that. And that has to do with at least the risk of making it so omnipresent that you're unable to differentiate degrees, unable to really detect concrete institutions, concrete practices, concrete parties, and criticize them. And so, I'm not very precise, but there is a sense of discomfort that we are sort of taking away the power of critique by turning it into a phenomenon that's everywhere and permanently present. So that's just my discomfort. And I wanted to once mention again Nikita's point about imagining the unimaginable, because I was only referring to it with regard to monstrous deeds and practices. But it's key, of course, at the same time while doing this, to indeed open the spaces for what was unthinkable in a utopian positive sense before. So I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to make sure that I only focused on that one aspect. One thing I just wanted to add that at least I, from my profession, felt uncomfortable of not having mentioned here today. And that is the question of the different genres of critique and the different genres of practices. I mean, I assume that was what the whole series of discussions was about. But for me as a writer, that is an extremely complicated question, and it also has to do with different spaces. What kind of spaces do I want to reach when? What kind of spaces do I need to get into with a particular kind of language, with a particular kind of, reimagination? And it's really also about the genre of speaking, the genre of writing. Yeah, so it's. I mean, maybe it's just. Maybe it's not quite clear to me whether you guys all consider writing to be theory or practice, and that's, I think, why I was struggling so much with the sound of it as if it was dichotomy, and evidently, at least I hope that for me it's not. So.
Although that bearing witness, which was is your written practice,
yes.
Praxis.
Yes.
I mean, I was hoping to make clear is the fully incorporated space in this space. Heather.
Well, I mean, to that point, I also think that our praxis looks differently depending on different audiences and who one tries to move. Who is one trying to make those stories legible to? So, I mean, when I'm serving on a National Academy of Sciences panel, that is a certain kind of audience that I'm trying to make this history legible to, which in turn will have a certain kind of audience to move the needle, which would be very different than an audience somewhere else. But the goal is still the same. The praxis goal would be the same, but it's one you have to think a lot about because, and how they don't run into each other and conflict with each other. I think just really quickly, I just wanted to say, what is your name? Darshana. The comment quickly about lawyers. It is interesting, though, about being service providers versus being more than service providers. And I would just invite you, and it's very easy for me to say because I'm not a lawyer, but I think that even that imagination is just much muddier and more complicated. We imagine that lawyers must be or might only be able to be service providers, but in fact, historically, the very praxis of lawyers, the very activism of lawyers has literally changed what is available to them to provide as services, right? So I think that's just a complicated space. The question that you raised about, this conundrum, who's in prison shouldn't be there and who's not in prison should be there. And I will say that this probably gets back to what I'm saving, which is Nikita and Jeff's point about imagination. I mean, what's really interesting is that formerly incarcerated people who've spent a lot of time in prison do not make that argument. People on the outside of prison make that argument, which is that prisons are places for, Wall Street and, why didn't Harvey Weinstein get 59 years? And people who are in prison say, because prisons aren't meant to reform anybody. They don't make anybody better or safer. So that's a really interesting moment and opportunity to think about praxis, not just theoretically, but what would it look like to really take sexual assault seriously? And what would it mean to to have people take real responsibility or repair something in society, which I think is exciting. And I think it gets to this question of, you know, imagination and humanizing. This is why I don't necessarily think that this reform abolition is just a question of the immediate is the reform and abolition is the political goal. I think we need to really think about what that relationship is. Because certainly as a historian, my sense of it, and I think you alluded to this, look, at every moment in history, world history, American history, when the needle has moved, it has been when people can imagine the needle moving. And how they imagine the needle moving is often the result of, you know, ironically, these incremental, humanizing acts. So, you know, things like, you know, women having the reform of the right to vote generates this incredibly powerful feminist moment of that's way beyond the right to vote and questions patriarchy and questions gender hierarchies. And so I want us to think a little bit about breaking down those dichotomies and to have the imagination that maybe it isn't an either or, that actually history suggests that perhaps they are much more complicatedly entwined, and that witnessing what is going on, the reason why that moves people is because they have enough of a sense of self to know that they would never want to experience that. And so part of that project of imagining is for everyone to feel about themselves that they should not nor should ever expect to be treated that way. And that's why, just to close the circle, that's why one of the reasons why the criminal justice reform, or however you want to say it, movement is particularly vibrant right now and exciting right now, is because it's being led by people who are from the inside, who are directly impacted. And so their energy is coming from the fact that they're human beings and they refuse to be treated, going all the way back to Attica, you know, as L.D. Barclay says, you know, we are men, we refuse to be beaten and driven as such. And it was that kind of imagination of what the world could look like that becomes revolutionary. I don't know. I'm hopeful. Let's end with something not
okay.
like
all right.
we're in
okay.
a vicious cycle we'll never escape.
Great. Thanks, Heather. And so my only question is whether, and I'm not sure whether...
Do you have the answer to the question?
I'll take any answer to this question. Whether or not we want to break down the dichotomy, view it as neither either or think that it's much more complicated, much more intertwined, or alternatively, kind of accentuate the conflict, the tension, because it's so productive, right? And so maybe we're doing the same thing. I'm not sure, but there is another way of thinking of it, is like not saying, well, let's get rid of this because it's all one, but rather to just really clash the two like a super collider, like the CERN super collider all the time, and just kind of, because it helps us show so much about our way of thinking the world and imagining the world, and on the other hand, our way of engaging it and trying to transform it.
Maybe they are linearly related, because if reform really was realized, think about it, if it really was the case that these spaces were humanized, then prisons would have to be abolished. Because they couldn't function because there would not be just capricious repressive control, and that's true of many things, right? So maybe it's actually neither of those. It's actually, I don't know, but I think it's important to think about.
Okay, well, you're going to get the last word, Heather. First of all, though, I want to really thank Rosalind Morris for bringing us back to the question of truth. You'll have to remember, of course, on September 12th, 2018, we started this seminar by reading Hannah Arendt on Truth and Politics, right? With Karuna Mantena and Ann Stoler and Stephen Lukes. And so it's been quite a ride. But I'm really glad that we've kind of circled back at this moment to think about those questions from which we departed, the questions of truth and politics and praxis and theory. So I want to make sure to invite you to the resistance to grand jury forms of political coercion tomorrow that Nikita Shepard has organized. It's going to be a terrific panel. I want to thank Robert Feldman and Total Webcasting for a great year of all the webcasting. I want to give a rousing round of applause to Guylaine Pagès, who has been extraordinary. She's been running the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought this year, and as you all know, basically running the Praxis 1313. So we are deeply indebted to you, Guylaine. And what you may not know is that Guylaine works all the time on contemporary critical praxis, but at the same time that only represents her 60 hours of work on that only represents about half of her time, and the other time she is engaged in praxis all the time, going out to Rikers, organizing all kinds of the Standing Rock litigation, organizing, our undergrads and others refer to her as the general, and with good reason, because when we get things going, she's running the show. So thank you, Guylaine. I want to thank, of course, our brilliant and intimidating critical theorists this evening. I know I was intimidated, and everybody else was, so it was wonderful that you could join us. And finally, I want to dedicate this last session to all the student protesters at Johns Hopkins, to their courage and to their praxis. Thank you.